Cleveland says this was always the plan, that Shedeur Sanders just needed time, that the depth chart was earned, that every decision was made the right way. But if that's true, then one question refuses to go away. Why does everything about this situation feel like damage control after the fact? Because here's what nobody can explain cleanly. A rookie quarterback, drafted later than expected, buried on the depth chart for months, suddenly gets his chance, and instead of looking overwhelmed, he looks ready. Calm, in control, confident in moments where most young quarterbacks fold. And the moment he proves it on the field, reports start swirling. Coaches get defensive. Media narratives shift overnight. And now, according to growing chatter out of Cleveland, the head coach himself may want out. That's not normal. This isn't just about one game or one decision. This is about a timeline that doesn't add up. For months, fans were told Shedeur wasn't ready, that he was behind mentally, that he needed to learn protections, calls, motions, the so-called complexities of the pro game. Fair enough until he steps on the field and runs the offense like someone who's been doing it for years. Suddenly, the story flips. Now we're told he was in the office every day. Now we're told the coaching staff was developing him all along. Now we're told this was always part of the process. So which version is real? Because both can't be true at the same time. And that's where this story gets uncomfortable. Because when a quarterback succeeds faster than expected, it doesn't just expose defenses. It exposes decisions. It exposes pecking orders. It exposes who believed and who didn't. And according to reports, that success may have created serious tension behind the scenes. Tension so strong that people around the league are now whispering that Kevin Stefanski wants out of Cleveland altogether. Not because Shedeur failed, but because Shedeur didn't. Think about that for a second. A rookie playing well shouldn't create chaos. It should create clarity, stability, confidence. But instead, what we're seeing is finger-pointing, narrative shifts, and media figures scrambling to reframe the past before the receipts catch up. Analysts are openly questioning who actually had control. Former players are floating the idea that Stefanski's hands may have been tied by ownership. Others believe he's being positioned as the fall guy for decisions made above his pay grade. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to stay locked in on all the latest NFL drama, make sure you hit that like button. It helps the video reach more people who love this content just like you. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another update, reaction, or storyline as it unfolds in real time. I also want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think about Shedeur Sanders' performance and the Browns' collapse? Drop your thoughts below and let's talk about it. And don't forget to share this video with friends who follow the NFL. Your support truly keeps the channel moving forward. And that's the real mystery here. Was Shedeur Sanders unfairly buried? Was Kevin Stefanski sabotaging, or was he handcuffed? And why is the story changing now, only after the results made denial impossible? Because once you start pulling on this thread, it stops being just about a quarterback. It becomes a story about power, accountability, and an organization with a long history of getting it wrong at the most important position in sports. And the deeper you go, the harder it is to believe this was ever just football. The moment everything changed didn't come with a headline. It didn't come with a press release or a dramatic announcement. It came in a split-second decision that left fans, analysts, and even former players staring at their screens asking the same question. Why would you do that right now? Shedeur Sanders had rhythm. The offense finally had life. The ball was coming out on time, drives were being sustained, and for the first time in a while, Cleveland didn't look like a team surviving in spite of its quarterback. It looked like a team being lifted by one. And then, in a situation that every young quarterback needs reps in, a 2-minute scenario designed to test poise and command, Shedeur was pulled. That's when the fire started. From the outside, the decision made no sense. This wasn't a blowout. This wasn't garbage time. This was exactly the kind of moment coaches usually want their future quarterback to experience. Pressure, urgency, the clock working against you. These are the snaps that separate potential from reality. And yet, instead of letting the rookie navigate it, the keys were handed to someone else, a quarterback who, according to reports, wouldn't even be part of the long-term picture. Fans noticed immediately. Analysts questioned it in real time. And online, the word sabotage started popping up not as a confirmed accusation, but as a reaction. A response to a choice that felt deliberate. Because when decisions repeatedly work against the same player at the same critical moments, people stop believing it's coincidence. Now, to be clear, no one outside the building truly knows the full rationale. Coaches will always say there's a plan, that there are things the public can't see, that practice performance matters. But that explanation starts to fall apart when the on-field results tell a completely different story. Because Shedeur wasn't struggling. He wasn't rattled. If anything, he looked like the most composed quarterback in the room. And that's where suspicion crept in. Because this wasn't an isolated moment. It fit into a broader pattern that had already frustrated fans for months. Limited reps, fourth-string placement, critical snaps going to others. And every time Shedeur showed progress, every time momentum started to build, something interrupted it. A substitution, a conservative call, a decision that slowed everything down. That's why this moment became the flashpoint. Not because one snap defines a career, but because it symbolized something bigger. It symbolized the disconnect between what people were seeing with their own eyes and what they were being told to believe. And once that gap opens, trust disappears fast. Former players began asking the obvious questions. If this kid is your future, why not test him? If you believe in him, why protect him from the very situations he'll face every Sunday? And if you don't believe in him, why keep saying you do? By the end of that sequence, the conversation had shifted. It was no longer just about development. It was about intent, about whether this was careful coaching or something far more calculated. And from that moment on, every decision that followed was viewed through a much harsher lens. Because once fans believe a fire has been lit, every move after that looks like fuel. Not long after that decision, the noise started getting louder. Quiet at first, almost easy to dismiss. But then it kept coming back. Reports, whispers, and league chatter all circling around the same idea. Kevin Stefanski might want out of Cleveland. At first glance, that sounds extreme. Coaches don't just walk away, especially not ones with resumes like his. Two-time Coach of the Year, a reputation as a steady, analytical mind. Someone who, on paper, should be secure, but timing matters. And the timing of these reports is exactly what made people stop and pay attention. Because this talk didn't surface when the team was losing quietly. It didn't surface when expectations were already low. It surfaced after Shedeur Sanders was named QB1 and immediately started delivering results that changed the narrative. That's what raised eyebrows. If this was all part of the plan, why would the head coach suddenly be linked to exit rumors now? According to multiple voices around the league, frustration has been building behind the scenes for a while. Not just about wins and losses, but about control. About who actually gets the final say when it comes to quarterbacks, game plans, and long-term direction. And once Shedeur stepped in and proved he could handle the moment, those tensions reportedly hit a breaking point. The theory making the rounds is simple, but uncomfortable. If Stefanski didn't believe in Shedeur, then Shedeur's success makes him look exposed. It turns every earlier decision into a question mark. Every snap he didn't get becomes a what-if. And that kind of scrutiny doesn't fade, it multiplies. But there's another version of this story that's gaining just as much traction. Some reports suggest Stefanski may not have been fully in control to begin with, that his quarterback decisions were influenced, if not outright dictated, by forces above him. Ownership, front office politics, draft investment. If that's true, then Shedeur's rise doesn't just make Stefanski look bad, it puts him in an impossible position. Either he admits he didn't have the power everyone assumed he did, or he stays silent and lets the narrative paint him as the villain. And in that scenario, wanting out starts to make sense. Because once the label sticks, the coach who tried to bury a franchise quarterback, it doesn't matter what the internal reality was. That's how you're remembered. That's how your career is framed. And insiders say Stefanski is well aware of that. What makes this even more explosive is how quickly Cleveland media began shifting their tone as these rumors spread. Questions got softer. Explanations got longer. And suddenly, stories started appearing that painted Stefanski as a quiet architect of Shedeur's growth rather than an obstacle in his path. That didn't calm the situation. It made it louder. Because when narratives change this fast, it signals fear. Fear that the truth, whatever it is about to surface. And if Stefanski really does want out, it won't be because of one quarterback or one season. It'll be because staying means owning a story that was never fully his to write. And once that door cracks open, it's almost impossible to close it again. The moment the rumors about Kevin Stefanski wanting out started gaining traction, something else shifted just as quickly: the tone of the Cleveland media. And it wasn't subtle. It was a full-on pivot that longtime observers picked up on immediately. For months, the message had been consistent. Shedeur Sanders was framed as a project. Talented, yes, but behind. Not quite there yet. Still learning the mental side. Still catching up to the speed of the league. That narrative was repeated often enough that it became accepted as fact. Until suddenly it was. Almost overnight, the language changed. Now the conversation wasn't about why Shedeur wasn't playing. It was about how much time he'd been spending in the building. How often he was in the office. How much one-on-one attention he was getting from Kevin Stefanski himself. According to this revised version of events, the same coach who allegedly buried him on the depth chart was now being credited as the mastermind behind his rapid development. That's when fans started pulling out receipts. Because what people remembered didn't match what they were being told. They remembered Shedeur listed fourth on the depth chart. They remembered limited reps. They remembered other quarterbacks getting opportunity after opportunity while Shedeur watched. So when media figures suddenly suggested that Stefanski had been quietly grooming him all along, it didn't land as insight, it landed as damage control. And the timing made it even harder to ignore. This shift didn't happen while Shedeur was struggling. It didn't happen during the weeks when questions about his readiness dominated the airwaves. It happened after he succeeded, after the results forced everyone to recalibrate. That's when the narrative needed fixing. Some fans believe the motivation is simple. Cleveland media members are tied to the organization. Access matters. Relationships matter. And when there's a real possibility that Stefanski could leave while Shedeur becomes the face of the franchise, being on the wrong side of that story suddenly looks risky. Because if Shedeur is the future, and all signs point that way, then the people covering the team have to live with that reality. They can't keep pushing an anti-Shedeur angle if he's going to be the quarterback they're writing about for the next decade. So the pivot begins. Softer takes, more praise, a subtle rewriting of how we got here. But that rewriting raised another uncomfortable question. If Stefanski truly believed in Shedeur all along, why did it take so long for the opportunity to arrive? Why did it require circumstances forcing the issue? And why did the praise only start once success was undeniable? That's why this section of the story matters so much. Because media narratives don't just reflect reality, they shape it. And when those narratives change abruptly, it often means someone is trying to get ahead of something they can't stop. Whether that's a coaching exit, an organizational shakeup, or simply the exposure of bad evaluations, one thing is clear. Cleveland media isn't just reporting the story anymore. They're trying to manage it. And when coverage turns from questioning decisions to justifying them, it tells you exactly how high the stakes have become. Up until this point, most of the debate lived in fan circles and local media. Opinions were split, emotions were high, but everything still felt contained. Then Shannon Sharpe stepped in, and that's when the conversation changed completely. Because Shannon didn't come at this like a fan or a blogger. He came at it like a former player who understands how power actually works inside an NFL building. And instead of asking whether Kevin Stefanski messed up, he asked something far more dangerous. What if Stefanski never had the freedom people think he did? On Nightcap, Shannon floated a theory that immediately reframed the entire situation. According to him, it's possible Stefanski wanted to play Shedeur Sanders earlier but was effectively handcuffed. Not by football logic, not by performance, but by decisions made above his pay grade, ownership, front office dynamics, draft investment. The kind of internal politics fans rarely get a clear look at. That single idea cracked the story wide open. Because if that's even partially true, then everything suddenly makes more sense. The uncomfortable press conferences, the vague answers, the constant references to process without clear explanations. It stops looking like incompetence and starts looking like someone walking a tightrope, trying not to say the wrong thing while following orders he didn't create. Shannon took it a step further by asking the question nobody else wanted to touch. How much control does Kevin Stefanski really have? Over the final roster? Over the draft? Over who starts at quarterback? Is he operating like a Mike Tomlin or an Andy Reid, or is he being asked to execute someone else's vision while taking all the heat when it fails? That's when the term fall guy entered the conversation. Shannon compared Stefanski's situation to others around the league who have taken the blame for decisions made by ownership. Coaches who wear the losses publicly while the real power stays hidden. And once that comparison was made, the narrative shifted instantly. This was no longer just about whether Shedeur was mismanaged. It was about whether Stefanski himself was being set up to fail. Other analysts on the panel didn't push back. In fact, they leaned in. They acknowledged Cleveland's history, the constant interference, the lack of clarity about who's really in charge. And in that context, Shannon's theory didn't sound far-fetched at all, it sounded familiar. But here, where it gets explosive. Even if Stefanski was handcuffed, perception doesn't care. History doesn't care. The public story will always be simpler than the truth. And the simple version is brutal. He's the coach who didn't play the franchise quarterback until he had no choice. That's why Shannon's take matters so much. Because it doesn't excuse anyone, it implicates everyone. Ownership, front office, coaching staff, media, all tied together in a system where accountability gets blurred and blame gets passed around. And once that possibility entered the conversation, there was no putting it back. Because now fans aren't just asking what happened. They're asking who actually made it happen. Once the conversation turned toward control and influence, the spotlight shifted to the one place where everything truly began, the draft. Because when you go back and look at how Cleveland handled the quarterback position on draft weekend, the logic starts to fall apart fast. On paper, the Browns made two separate bets. First, they selected Dillon Gabriel earlier in the draft. Then, a couple of rounds later, they took Shedeur Sanders. And that alone raised eyebrows across the league. Teams don't usually double-dip at quarterback unless there's uncertainty. If you're convinced you found your guy, you don't hedge that belief almost immediately. That contradiction is where the confusion starts. If Dillon Gabriel was viewed as the clear answer, then why spend another pick on a quarterback with starter-level traits? And not just any quarterback, one who, according to many analysts, had been undervalued throughout the entire draft process. The move suggested doubt, but the way the season unfolded suggested something else entirely. Because despite being drafted later, Shedeur didn't get the developmental runway you'd expect from a team uncertain about its starter. Quite the opposite. Draft position became destiny. Gabriel, as the higher pick, was treated as the default option. He received earlier reps, more opportunities, more patience. That's not speculation, that's how NFL hierarchies usually work. And that's exactly the problem. Draft order is supposed to reflect evaluation, not override it. But in Cleveland, it appeared to do both. Gabriel's earlier selection locked him into a pecking order that no amount of practice performance could immediately disrupt. Meanwhile, Shedeur, despite strong showings whenever he touched the field, had to fight uphill just to be seen. Former players and analysts called this out quickly. You don't draft a quarterback thinking, he might not be it. And you definitely don't follow that up by drafting another quarterback 2 rounds later unless you're already uneasy. As one analyst put it, it's like buying a car while openly admitting it might break down, then acting shocked when it does. That analogy hit home because it exposed the flaw in Cleveland's approach. The front office tried to protect itself by keeping options open, but in doing so, it created confusion at the most important position on the team. Instead of clarity, they created competition without transparency. Instead of development, they created delay. And here's the part that's hardest to ignore. When training camp and preseason rolled around, Shedeur's numbers reportedly stacked up as well as, if not better than, anyone else in the room. The performance gap fans were told existed simply didn't show up on the stat sheet, yet the depth chart barely moved. That's when the draft conversation stopped being academic and started feeling personal. Because if performance didn't matter as much as draft status, then the process was flawed from the start. And if Stefanski was expected to follow that pecking order, then his hands may have been tied long before week 1. The draft wasn't just a miscalculation. It was the foundation for everything that followed. And once Shedeur started winning, it didn't just challenge the depth chart. It exposed how shaky that foundation really was. As the draft logic unraveled, attention shifted to something even harder to explain away: the reps. Because when teams truly believe in a quarterback, they don't hide him. They test him. They challenge him. They put him in situations that force growth. And that's where Cleveland's handling of Shedeur Sanders raised even more questions. Throughout training camp and into the preseason, reports suggested a clear pattern. Shedeur wasn't consistently working with the starters. He wasn't being plugged into the same offensive looks. Instead, he was often paired with other rookies and depth pieces, players fighting for roster spots rather than roles in the core offense. That alone shapes perception. If you're not throwing to the top targets, you're not being evaluated on equal ground. Yet despite that, the results kept showing up. Whenever Shedeur did get snaps, the efficiency was there. The decision-making was sharp. The ball placement stood out. Statistically, he wasn't lagging behind. In many cases, he was leading. And that's what made the silence so loud. Because normally, strong practice and preseason numbers force a conversation. They demand explanation. Instead, there was very little acknowledgement at all. That disconnect became impossible to ignore. Former players pointed out something crucial. Reps aren't just about development, they're about trust. When a quarterback consistently works with second and third unit players, it sends a message, not just to him, but to the entire locker room. It signals where he stands in the organization's eyes, regardless of what's said publicly. And yet, when game situations finally aligned and Shedeur was given a real opportunity, the performance didn't change. If anything, it improved. That's when the narrative officially cracked, because the excuse that he needed more time stopped holding weight. You don't manage the pocket that cleanly. You don't process defenses that quickly. You don't lead drives under pressure without being prepared. So the obvious question emerged. If the play was always there, why wasn't the opportunity? That's where the silence from the organization became telling. No clear explanation, no acknowledgement of the shift, just a quiet continuation of business as usual, as if the months leading up to this moment never happened. Analysts started connecting the dots. Maybe the lack of reps wasn't about readiness at all. Maybe it was about optics, about not disrupting the established pecking order, about protecting draft investment and front office decisions from being questioned too early. Because once you admit the fifth-round quarterback is outperforming the higher pick, you invite scrutiny. And scrutiny is the last thing a shaky organization wants. But football has a way of forcing the truth to the surface. You can manage reps. You can control narratives. You can delay decisions. What you can't do is hide production forever. Eventually, the tape speaks. And when it did, it left Cleveland with fewer answers than ever. Because the reps didn't lie. The stats didn't lie. The only thing missing was a clear explanation, and that silence may have said more than any press conference ever could. By the time Shedeur Sanders' performance forced its way into the spotlight, the conversation had grown beyond quarterbacks and coaches. What people were really reacting to was something deeper, organizational dysfunction that felt all too familiar in Cleveland. Because this wasn't happening in a vacuum. The Browns have lived in chaos at the quarterback position for years. Different regimes, different philosophies, different plans that never seem to last long enough to succeed. Every few seasons, it's the same cycle: reset, rebrand, repeat. And when you drop Shedeur's situation into that history, it stops looking like an isolated misstep and starts looking like another chapter in a long-running pattern. What made this case stand out was how many layers were involved. Ownership, front office, coaching staff, media, each with overlapping influence but unclear accountability. When decisions go right, everyone claims credit. When they go wrong, responsibility gets blurred. And that's exactly what people saw playing out in real time. If Stefanski truly had full control, then the questions about why Shedeur was buried are unavoidable. But if he didn't, if ownership or the front office dictated the quarterback hierarchy, then that exposes a much bigger issue. It means the head coach is expected to lead without real authority while still being the public face of every failure. That's not a sustainable model. Former players and analysts pointed out how rare it is for successful organizations to operate this way. In stable franchises, roles are clearly defined. Coaches coach. Front offices build. Owners support. In Cleveland, those lines have reportedly been crossed too often, creating a constant power struggle that bleeds onto the field. And when that happens, players feel it. Quarterbacks especially. They can sense uncertainty. They know when decisions are being made for reasons that have nothing to do with performance. And once that trust erodes, development stalls. Confidence wavers. Careers get derailed before they ever really begin. That's why Shedeur's success was so disruptive. It didn't just highlight his talent, it highlighted how close the organization came to mishandling it. And that realization made everyone uncomfortable. Because if this nearly went wrong, what else has gone wrong in the past without anyone noticing? The media response only reinforced that perception. Instead of hard questions, there were softer explanations. Instead of accountability, there were justifications. And when coverage starts protecting systems instead of challenging them, fans lose faith fast. At that point, the dysfunction becomes visible. This is why the rumors about Stefanski wanting out resonated so strongly. Not because fans wanted him gone, but because they understood the environment. Good coaches don't want to operate in uncertainty. They don't want to be judged on decisions they didn't fully control. And they definitely don't want their legacy defined by a situation that was mismanaged from the start. In the end, this isn't just about Cleveland almost getting it wrong again. It's about what happens when an organization repeatedly fails to align power, vision, and accountability. And once that disconnect is exposed, no amount of damage control can put it back in the box. As messy as Cleveland's situation looked, it was only part of a much bigger problem. Because once Shedeur Sanders started producing on an NFL field, the spotlight shifted away from one organization and onto the entire league. And that's where the real embarrassment began. This wasn't just about the Browns almost mishandling a quarterback. This was about 31 other teams watching Shedeur slide down the draft board and deciding, over and over again, that he wasn't worth the risk. Not in the first round. Not in the second. Not even in the middle rounds where teams usually take swings on upside. They passed, and they kept passing. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, those decisions look shaky at best. Shedeur didn't walk into the league overwhelmed. He didn't look lost. He didn't play like someone catching up to the speed of the game. He looked prepared, comfortable, confident in tight windows and high-pressure situations. Analysts began pointing out throws that very few quarterbacks can make, the kind of anticipatory passes that separate starters from backups. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether he belonged. It was how the league misread him so badly. For years, NFL teams have claimed they prioritize poise, processing, leadership, and toughness at the quarterback position. Those were supposed to be Shedeur's strengths. Yet when draft night arrived, something didn't add up. The traits teams said they valued didn't match the choices they made. That contradiction reignited an uncomfortable debate. Was Shedeur downgraded because of where he came from? Because of narratives that followed him long before draft evaluations began? Because teams convinced themselves he was more polished than elite or more confident than coachable? None of that has been proven, but the fact that fans are even asking those questions tells you how loud the miss feels now. And it's not just fans. Former players have been blunt. If Shedeur continues on this trajectory, every team that passed on him will have to answer for it. Front offices will be asked why a quarterback with his resume, composure, and production didn't even get serious consideration early. Coaches will be asked what they missed. Scouts will be asked how the evaluation went so wrong. Because this isn't a fluke story. This isn't a seventh-round miracle or a one-game hot streak. This looks like a quarterback who was ready long before anyone wanted to admit it. And that's where the embarrassment cuts deepest. The NFL prides itself on being the best talent-evaluating machine in sports. Billions of dollars spent on scouting, analytics, interviews, and psychological profiling. And yet, a quarterback who checks nearly every box slips through the cracks and ends up being doubted at every level. Cleveland didn't just luck into Shedeur. The league let him fall. And now, as he continues to prove himself, the narrative is shifting from surprise to accountability. Because once the excuses run out, all that's left is the tape. And the tape doesn't care about draft position, pre-draft narratives, or missed evaluations. It only cares about who can play. And that's exactly why this story doesn't end in Cleveland. It echoes across the entire NFL. Now that the dust is starting to settle, the most uncomfortable part of this story isn't what happened on the field. It's the questions that still don't have clean answers and maybe never will. Was Kevin Stefanski actually trying to bury Shedeur Sanders, or was he carrying out a plan he didn't fully control? If his hands were tied by ownership or the front office, does that change how his decisions should be judged? Or does responsibility still fall on the head coach, regardless of what happens behind closed doors? Those questions cut right to the heart of how accountability works in the NFL, and Cleveland's situation exposes just how murky that line can be. Then there's the media. Were early doubts about Shedeur fair analysis, or were they shaped by access, relationships, and organizational pressure? And when the narrative shifted after his success, was that growth or self-preservation? Because rewriting the past doesn't erase it. Fans remember the depth charts. They remember the reps. They remember who was praised and who was doubted before the results made it impossible to ignore. And that leads to Shedeur himself. What does it say about a league that nearly talked itself out of a quarterback who was ready all along? How many evaluations were influenced by perception instead of performance? How many teams convinced themselves they knew better than the tape? Because every snap Shedeur takes moving forward will quietly answer those questions, whether anyone wants them answered or not. The truth is, there doesn't have to be a single villain in this story. It's entirely possible that this was a perfect storm of flawed evaluations, rigid hierarchies, and an organization struggling to align power and vision. But acknowledging that doesn't make the consequences disappear. Careers were affected, narratives were shaped, and trust, once lost, is hard to rebuild. What happens next may matter even more than what's already happened. If Stefanski stays, can he truly reset the relationship with a quarterback the public believes he didn't want? If he leaves, does that confirm he was the fall guy, or does it validate the criticism that followed him? And for Cleveland as a whole, will this finally force real introspection, or will it just become another chapter that gets quietly filed away? As for Shedeur, the path forward is clear. Win, lead, let the tape speak. Because every time he steps on the field, he rewrites the story in real time, no spin required. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable truth of all. Because once results start piling up, excuses disappear, narratives collapse, and the only thing left standing is what people tried so hard not to see in the first place. So the real question isn't whether mistakes were made. It's whether anyone is finally willing to own them.
If you enjoyed today's breakdown and want to keep up with all the drama, trades, and behind-the-scenes action in the NFL, then don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and lets us know you love this kind of content. And hey, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends, your group chats, or anyone who loves football as much as you do. The more the conversation spreads, the better it gets. Most importantly, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss when we drop fresh stories, wild rumors, or breaking updates that the mainstream media won't talk about.